you deal with probably the thing that I would want to avoid the most is how do you transition ownership or leadership in an organization that's family ran? Be like, Dad, come on, put me in charge, please. No, Steve, we've known you since you were like a little kid, and this is what you're going. I can't imagine what it's like. Why in the world would you choose to plant your flag in the middle of that chaos?
Steve, you've brought up so many points that I could riff off of, but yeah, I have chosen to plant my flag into what we call, some people call the family circle. So there's this model of family business that came out of Harvard from back in the 1980s. John Davis came up the 3-circle model, and it's basically there's the business, there's the family, and there's the ownership, and they overlap. And some people are owners and they work in the business, but they're not family. Some people are family that, so there's 7 different places in those 3 circles. And that's what makes everything interesting. And when I got into this gig of working with families, I actually decided consciously to plunge directly into the family side of things and the family circle, because I realized that it is the most important circle in many, especially when there's upcoming transitions from one generation to the next. And also, it's the most neglected side. Like every business will have their lawyer, their accountant, all their people, the outside advisors to help them with that. Mm-hmm. And they don't often think that they want help or know where to find help on some of the more family stuff. And so I've gotten into the whole coaching and mediating game on that score because I grew up in a family business. So I have the lived experience. And that was a perfect connection from the early part of my career to this later part.
The typical image of the son who's going to take over or the family who's going to take over is like they don't deserve it. They haven't worked hard. They're not bought in. I think of the Caddyshack movie where the lazy son, I don't know if it's Danny Boy or I'm trying to remember his name, but that's usually the image of who's going to take over. And often there's some version of that going on where the energy or the original drive doesn't exist, but yet the father or maybe the starting one, like you said, that had the lightning in the bottle, they feel somewhat obligated to pass it down, even though that maybe the horsepower doesn't exist in the next heir.
Exactly. And in fact, for me, it was probably a blessing in disguise. Because I really didn't have the entrepreneurial spirit that my father had. Mm-hmm. And, by that time, he had already sort of moved himself up to like chairman and CEO and had hired a professional president, because I was coming back and I was 27. Even if the business had stayed really viable on its own, he had already hired someone to be the president. My role was to shadow him and be the assistant to the president for a few years until I was old enough to take over. But, many families don't have that all figured out that way, right? And so just helping, what I do now is I help families look at that whole process on a much longer term basis than they probably are. So a proper transition from one generation to the next should be like a minimum of 5 years, if not 10 years in the planning. But often families don't get out in front of it soon enough or early enough. And then they end up doing a transition in a crisis when someone has a health event or someone gets divorced and now there's new ownership structures and new things come into play. So I always try to help people get a longer term perspective on things and be objective and sort of look at it and plan it on a longer term basis to make sure you get, and you alluded to it earlier, you talked about transitioning the leadership and the ownership. And those are 2 different things and they don't always happen at the same time. And that's another thing people don't always realize. I still remember one of my first meetings with my first major client. It was supposed to be with the mom and the dad and the accountant. And I showed up and the dad didn't show up because he had to put out a fire at work or whatever. So there I am with the mother and their trusted advisor. And the mother says, I've been thinking about this for 10 years and I've been talking to my husband about it for 5 years and now we're finally doing something. Mm-hmm. And so often the mother will have that CEO role, as in chief emotional officer. And this was a particular case where the mother had seen how having this business in their family had adversely affected her husband's relationship with his siblings. And she had basically said, damned if I'm going to let that happen and let this business screw up my kids and their relationship amongst themselves. And so they got out in front of it and hired someone, me, to work with their sibling group. So here was two brothers and two sisters in their late 20s, early 30s. And I just worked for them for 4 years, helping them to learn to work together. Because that's what it is. Like, people don't think, they think of the business itself and how the business will survive. And I always try to gear them towards, well, don't forget the family along the way. And so this particular business had 3 of the 4 kids worked in the business and 1 didn't. And so you have that one outsider. And there's this whole imbalance, an information asymmetry, I call it. And you've got to work on that. You can't have somebody feeling left out. So we worked on, I coached them and facilitated with them that they took for them to learn to work together as a team. Because as I explained it to them, look, fast forward a few decades, your parents are no longer in the picture. Who's looking after this? It's not him or her, it's all of you. And if you only start to work together after a funeral or after something happens, you're not going to be able to figure out how to work together as a team and learn who can play what role well and how to relate to each other to keep this whole big train on the track, because there are a lot of obstacles. And you really don't want the family relationships to become the obstacle that derails the train.
It seems like one of the dilemmas would be for the one that was convinced they need to implement some sort of transition plan was, who do I pick? Because if I pick a dud, that's going to be a waste of time and money.
Yes. And so we were talking before about people who have like a psychology degree. Okay, great. But I've been to, there's another organization I'm a part of called the Purposeful Planning Institute. And I was at the first time I went to one of their meetings, and we were doing an icebreaker thing around the table. And it was that question where, like, if you had a magic wand, what would you fix? And this woman who was a psychologist said, if I could wave the magic wand, all psychologists would be financially literate. And I was like, wow, what? And then I realized, you know what? Some of the people with whom I'm competing for a seat at that family table don't really know the difference between $1 million and $1 billion. And, there's a big difference. Mm-hmm. and it's not just the 3 zeros, it's in what and so someone who does not have that ability, who shows up at the table, will not be able to get the respect of the people around the table. And so I talk about my willingness and my desire to work in the family circle. Luckily for me, I have some credentials on my business card that allow me to go through the business door to get to the family. So I have an MBA, I have a CFA, Chartered Financial Analyst. So I can talk to the person who may not want someone to deal with their family, but I can earn their trust by being able to talk business with them and then work my way into the family system issues later on.